Okay, this is going to be part 3 of our 68 SS396L Camino 12 bolt posi rebuild. In this segment, what we're going to do is put the gears into the housing and set up the backlash and pinion depth and all that. So what we have here is we have the carrier that's been rebuilt, have the new ring installed and torqued down and all that. It's ready to go. We have new bearings for the pinion. This is the inner bearing. This is the outer bearing for the pinion. We have the shims for setting the backlash. We have a seal, new nut, because you need a new nut on there. And also we have the shims for setting the pinion depth. On the pinion, like I mentioned in the last video, there's a number on here that you will use to set your pinion depth. What I have here is a bearing. This is the inner bearing that I use that is called a setup bearing. And what you do is you get a bearing that's in good condition or a new bearing. This was a new one. And I put into my drill press, I put one of those little, it's like a stone, you know, for grinding, and put it in the drill press and ran it on a slow speed, and then I carefully held on to this and I went around and honed out the inside of it a little bit, because these bearings are a press fit. If I try to put a new one on, it won't go on unless it gets pressed on. So this one here, what you can do is you can put it on and you can take it off to work on setting your pinion depth easily. Once you got that figured out what shims you will need for that, then you put it all together with the other stuff. Another thing here that I did, this is called the crush leaf. You put this in between when you're putting the housing together. That goes in between that bearing and then the outer bearing. And then as you tighten down this nut here, once it's in the housing, you can set the preload of how tight this thing will churn once it's in the housing. And what that does is it crushes this thing. This already comes partially crushed, but it's a pain. It's a pain to get it down there, and you really work at it. So what they have that I bought and I decided to use on this is what I used on the 8.8 that I did a while back, is what this is. It's a solid, it's not a crush leaf, but it takes the place of the crush leaf. I can't think of what it's called offhand. And it has several shims in it as well. So what you do is you put that in there and then you check it and see if that's not right. Then you add or subtract shims until you get to the proper amount of preload in there. Pretty slick deal right there. And so we'll be using that. A couple other things. Of course, we have the instructions. Need those. We have a dial indicator on a magnetic stand for setting the backlash, and a digital caliper for setting the pinion depth. And also, if we need to check the thicknesses of the different shims or whatnot, the digital comes in real handy. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so first thing we'll do is we'll get this seal out and pop it out with a punch or a hammer, hopefully. Okay, so I went ahead and drove the seal out. Took a little bit of finagling, but smacked it from the side, which kind of will loosen it up a little bit, and then just worked my way around until it came out. Then, behind that one is the bearing and the race. So the bearing came right out, and then the race, you come back from the other side with a punch and a hammer, and there's a couple little tabs you can beat them out. And that's for the outer, or for the outer pinion bearing, and then the inner pinion bearing is inside of the housing, and it's just basically the same thing. So I already installed the inner race, and I'll go ahead and install the outer race right here. So what I did was I just wiped it out, got it kind of cleaned out. and get my race and set it in there. And what you want to do with these, I have a seal driver. It's a nice little Harbor Freight item, but I put it on backwards because you don't want this tapered part really riding inside of here, because I don't want to take a risk of nicking the brand new bearing, and it'll sit just fine on the outer side and apply even pressure. So I'll drop that in, and the trick to this is to make sure it goes in straight. You got to get it in there and kind of feel around, because getting it started is the key, or getting it started straight is the key to it going in smoothly. Once you've got it in far enough, you know, halfway the distance that it needs to go in, then you could drive it home. But if you get it cocked a little bit, it could be a pain to get in there. So let me go ahead and get this in there. And now it's in, now I can drive it home. Now you can see how the hammer will bounce on that last one. You know that it's home if it bounces back, because it's got some resistance in there. All right, so now that we're done with that, what I'll do next is I will take my pinion, and I've already played around with this a little bit, and I got a couple of shims on there that I feel are going to be the right thickness. So a lot of times what you can do is take apart the old one that came out, and the shim that's in there will be really close to what goes in there, but I didn't want to pull it apart. And I have the shims and everything, so I'm just going to do it this way. So this will go in here, and I'll use the old top bearing will go in there, because it was sliding right over here really nicely. Or the new one is a little bit more of a tight fit, and I'll put that on when I go ahead and put it in there for real. So I'll go ahead and stick this in. Get it in there and get it started. You want to get it tight. Now, you're not supposed to hammer these down with an impact, but since this is the old nut and that's the old bearing and a setup bearing I'm using, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to go ahead and run it down. And basically, what I'm after is just getting the play, getting the play out of it. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and check the pinion depth. Now, according to the instructions here, it's kind of hard to see, there's a light coming on me a bad way. I have the number I wrote down. Can't really make it come out any better. I have the number that I wrote down that's written on here, so that way I can get the proper depth. Now in here, well, I can't show you because the light's bad. Halfway, what you want to measure is from the center line of the axle or bearing that's going to hold the carrier, the center line of the carrier, down to the top of the pinion itself. That's your pinion depth. That's what needs to be measured. And it happens that these saddles right here, where the caps go on, that bottom part right there is halfway. So you can take a measurement from there. They sell a tool for it, but I've never owned one, and from what I hear, they're a real pain to work with unless you buy a really expensive one, and really just a digital caliper will take care of it for you. So the way that we do this is we're going to put a flat piece of steel on there, and I'm going to set it up here so I don't have to move it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my caliper and I'm going to measure down from the top here, and it'll measure from the top here to the top of there, right like that. Make sure I'm in the right spot with it. Okay, so there's my measurement. Now what I'll do, this is where a digital one comes in handy. I'll just go ahead and 0 it. Now I'm at 0. So now I'll be able to measure from this down up here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just subtracting that number there. So when I come to there, I'm at 2.8430. Check it again. Make sure I'm where I want to be. Two point. 2.48, and I need 2.848, and I need 2.825. So I'm really close. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pull it back apart, and I'll measure out my shims, and I'll try to get the next one a little bit closer. So I'll go ahead and shut the camera off for that, and I will be right back. Okay, so it took a little bit of finagling back and forth. I ended up swapping back and forth. I had 4 of these shims, and I ended up swapping back and forth, and I settled in on 45 thousandths shim in there. My measurement that's on the pinion is 2.825, and after a little bit of finagling, I got it down to, if you can see it, 2.826. So I'm going to call that good. I think that's actually really, really good. And we'll move on from there. So those are gone. Now what I'll go ahead and do now is drop the carrier in and go ahead and put the caps on and see how that all sits in there. Now these spacers are what come with it. And actually when this one was set up before, when I pulled it apart, there was no shims, just the spacers in there. So that's how I'm going to set it up first. But there's a bevel edge on the spacer, and it goes towards the axle, away from the carrier. I pulled it in and pulled it out a few times. Actually, the factory spacers did not fit in here. They were too wide with the other bearings and whatnot. So that's fine because I had all of these other shims and everything. So I ended up, this kit comes with 4 thick shims and then all of these small ones to go in there. So I put 2 thick ones on either side, and then I messed back and forth with these. Took a little bit, so it was kind of boring on the camera and a little frustrating at times and monotonous, so whatever. Anyways, they recommend between 8 and 12 thousandths of backlash, and that's going to be the distance that your pinion churns and your ring churns. So there should be a little bit of space in the teeth. They say 8 to 12 thousandths, and you can see, right, if you can see on the dial indicator, we're at about 9 thousandths of backlash. So that's right in there, so I'll go ahead and take that off. Next step would be to check the pattern on the ring tooth, make sure that it's right in there, and when these come, they have a section in there. Now that I move the camera to the other side, you won't be able to see it, but they come already pre-set, or not set, but checked to make sure that they'll fit. So anyways, I'll make sure that that pattern matches what I'm gonna do. It didn't come with paint. Some of these come with paint, some of them don't. A trick I learned was take some of this, what is this, anti-seize lubricant, which will work just fine, and you paint a few teeth with it, because it'll get a color on there for you. And the guy that showed me this, he went crazy with it. He did the whole pretty much the whole thing, but I don't want to go too wild with it. Just enough on there that you can get a, you know, a good couple of inches of pattern that you'll be able to see. And then what you want to do, is you want to grab a hold of your pinion and roll it around to where the two will come together. You know that you're in there, I can see it. All right, now you want to grab a hold and you want to do this with tension on it. See what her pattern looks like. Alrighty, now according to we want to have on this side here, which is going to be this side, we want it into the middle, which I can see that it is, and then on the other side, which is going to be this side, we want it more towards the bottom, which it is. So actually, we got a really good pattern on there, and I'm happy with it. So it's setting the pinion depth. If you don't have the pinion depth set to begin with, then you're gonna fight it, because not only are you trying to work with your backlash and that pattern, but you're trying to get your pinion in the right spot, which can send it all over the place, because everything is at an angle with these teeth. So it's hard to think in your head, it needs to go this way, it needs to go that way. So the best thing to do is get that pinion depth set first. Don't just cowboy it in there. Get the pinion depth set first, and then you can go ahead and do everything from there. So I'm happy with the way that it's set up. Everything seems to go pretty good. Now what I'll do is I'll tear it down, and we'll go ahead and put everything back together for real this time. So, okay, so in order to set up the new spacer that's going to take the place of the crush leaf, we'll go ahead and measure the crush leaf. And it's 2.302. And I have a 2.303, so we're right in there. And the way I adjusted that was with the varying shims that it comes with. And I have a couple left over here that I'll set aside. So again, I'm happy with that. That'll go in there just fine. So that's that piece that goes in between there. No longer need the crush leaf. Move that aside. So now we have the bearing that was the setup bearing that just slides on. We're not going to need that anymore. But now we need to put on the new bearing that is a different, it needs to be pressed on, or the other thing you can do is just heat it up. And when you heat it up, it'll expand and it'll just drop right on. So that's what I'm going to do, because I don't have a hydraulic press as of yet. But one of the things I haven't collected. So I'll go ahead and start this up. You just want to heat it up. You don't want to melt it. It's starting to get a little discoloration on there, so that's probably good. Oh yeah. Now, just like that, what didn't fit Now fits perfectly. Nice. All right, so we'll let that cool down, and then I'll head back over to the axle and we'll start putting some of this stuff together. Okay, we'll go ahead and start our final assembly now. So I'll take a new bearing, the new outer bearing that goes in there. I'm going to use a little bit of assembly lube on the bearings just because I may or may not need it, I don't know, but definitely isn't going to hurt to put a little bit of assembly lube on them. That way when I drive it for the first time, it's not dry. Just a little bit, it don't need that much. Drive the seal in there. Okay, so let's get this seal driven in. All right, that looks like that is all the way in. Now, go ahead, some stuff out of the way here. Rock that back a little bit. My pinion gear, it's cooled off a little bit now. Some assembly lube on this as well. Should be good. Work it in somewhat. All right. Got ahead of myself. All right. Okay. You know, I've always worked on stuff pretty much by myself. And so doing all this on video is definitely a new experience. It's not the same as, you know, just doing stuff. You know, I have to talk about what I'm doing as I'm doing it instead of just mumbling to myself. So, a little bit different. So what I'm gonna do is lightly hit it with the impact. Just to get it down in there. All right, next step here, we're gonna go ahead and drop the carrier in. I got the pinion all in and torqued down. Got it all figured out. It took a couple of times playing back and forth with that spacer to get the right shim in there. And but I got it in there and it's right. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put the carrier back in. Again, I'm gonna put a little bit of assembly lube. I'm not sure if I need to or not, but like I said, you know, better to have not needed it than to have needed it. And you know, this isn't something I do every day. So, you know, if I did this for a living, then I might have a different opinion on this, but I don't. So this is how I'm going to do it. way so I don't drop it a bunch of times. All right, now we will get this in. Now I already have my shims set up from when we did the backlash and the pattern. So I just have to put everything back the way that it was. That side's in. Okay. Those guys in. Now these caps here, they have a bevel on one side, just in case they get flopped around or whatever. The bevel on one side, it kind of corresponds to the radius, the curve of the housing there. So just in case they get mixed around. Still, it's really important that the right one stays on the right one and the left one stays on the left side. So go ahead and put those in. To be torqued to 65 foot-pounds. I already got my torque wrench already set. Pull them down a little bit first. There's 65. There's 65. Try it again. Alrighty. Now, this side. Alrighty. And that is that. I can put my double check, make sure nothing moved. Oh, that's right. I'm not on it. Right where I need to be. Right in there. Let's see. Yep, 10 thousandths. Right in there. Good. We are good. Happy with that? That is pretty much it. I have to pull out the pin here. Out. And the axles go back in. I don't need to do that. We've seen that when I pulled it apart. But the axles will go back in, C-clips go back in. And then, of course, because I'm old school, the crowning touch, the chrome 12-bolt cover. So I'll get all this finished up and put back together. The next video that I'll do, well, this will complete the rear end rebuild. It's just buttoning it up. That's a bunch of boring stuff to watch. And next video, I'll be replacing the bushings and hanging the rear end back in there. Then I'm also gonna redo all the brake lines on the front to back on the car with a copper nickel brake line. So thanks for watching.